Hi there everybody, my name is Rich Helvey. I work for NBC. I'm the lead animator for Access Hollywood, and basically all day long I'm doing flying logos, which some people might think is kind of boring because everyone wants to do spaceships and explosions and all that, but flying logos can actually be really fun. The tricky part for our show is that we have a really tight deadlines. We get orders at 8:30 in the morning. They need to be done by 12:30. So we have to do quality work really quickly, and that's what we're going to show you how to do today. So let's get started. So here's our first project. I'm going to walk you through the whole modeling steps first, where we bevel and extrude our type and get it ready for layout. Then in layout, we're going to take it, we're going to surface it, we're going to animate it, we're going to render it, and then we're going to do some post-processing later on. So the first step that I always do is I get art from our lead designer, Eric, who's laid it out in Illustrator. We're going to take that into Modeler and start working with it there. So the first thing that we want to do is import that Illustrator file into Modeler. The way we do that is through the EPSF loader, which is under the File menu. It pops up this handy little interface. I like to keep the curve subdivision level fine. That's usually good enough because you want your curved letters to look nice and smooth. If you're standard or rough, you get blocky edges and that doesn't look good. Okay, so then the next step is to change your convert to from closed polygons and polylines to just closed polygons. And now we'll go find the file, and we're going to go into our Illustrator directory, which is in your content directory, and we'll find motion graphics, because that's what we're doing. Now we want to leave auto axis drill unchecked. Auto axis drill cuts out the holes in letters like O and A and D. But if you have overlapping letters in your Illustrator file, it also actually cuts out the part where they overlap, and we don't want to do that. I want control over what gets cut out, so I leave that off. Auto centering just centers it in the middle of your screen. You turn that on or off, doesn't matter. I always leave it on. Scale doesn't matter either because you can resize that easily enough on your own. So hit OK, and it imports it. Now if we look down here, and let's expand this view to fill up the whole screen by hitting 0 on the number keypad, and then we'll zoom in with the period key. You'll notice that we have nice, good letters. Zoom in a little more. Nice and smooth. Now what would have happened if we hadn't changed curve subdivision to fine? Let's say we had done it on rough. Let's move to a new layer, and I'm going to go to import again, but this time I'm going to say rough. Everything else is the same. Notice it's pretty ugly. You don't want to do this. This is bad. Okay, so let's get rid of that. Go back to layer 1, and we see that the holes in O and some of the other letters did not get cut out. So we have to do that. That's our first step. If you forget to do this, you'll be in trouble later on. Go to polygon selection mode, and we'll zoom in a little bit, and we'll select the inside of the O, move over, hold down the Shift key to select the next O, and the G, and the A, and the P. And there we go. We'll cut these out of here and put them in a background layer. Like so. Then we'll set the original type to the foreground. That's our background layer, so we have a little template. Now go to the drill button under the multiply tab. We're working on the z-axis because we're cutting along the z-axis in this view. We also want to change from core to tunnel. Tunnel will cut holes through it. And there you go. Now we have nice letters. Except you'll notice that the G got a little goofy here. Every now and then this will happen. I'm not sure why, but it does. I'll show you how to fix this really quickly. We'll undo it. And we'll take the G, select that polygon, then go to point selection mode, and grab these 2 points here, and then we'll hit Control L, which will split this polygon into 2. Now when we do our drill, it works just fine. We don't have that weird little chunk coming out. I don't know what happens, it does. But before we move on, we want to then take those 2 polygons, select them, hit Shift Z. This unifies them into one polygon, and now we're back to where we should have been earlier. Now we have our nice holes cut out in all the letters. So we can get rid of this second layer. We don't ever need these again. Goodbye. Go back to our first layer. Now, it looks good, but it's a little flat. We're working in 3D. We want to take advantage of that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to extrude the letters, give them a little bit of depth. Zoom in a little bit here on the side mode, on the right-hand view. Hit Shift-E for extrude. Now, if you just start dragging, you can extrude in any direction. We don't really want to do that. What we want to do is hold down the Control key and drag it out, and that locks it, so it has to come straight back. Now, let's see, how fat do we want to make these? Probably something like that. That looks pretty good. Okay, now we'll hit Enter to take that. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to make little bevels around the edges of the faces. This is going to be to catch little highlights and just make the text just a little bit more interesting. So again, from the right-hand view, use the right mouse button to do a lasso select of the front and back faces. And then I hit B for bevel. And we'll zoom in a little bit more. We'll bevel in. And it's really nice that Lightwave does this interactively now. So now we have these nice little bevels. One thing you want to be careful about with the bevel tool is not to make the bevels too big. If we made them too big, we get these weird things where the face actually crosses over itself. And that's not really all that good. You'll get strange rendering errors that way. So we'll go with that. That's pretty good. It's maybe a little deep. So that looks good. Now the next step that we want to do is we want to surface the face and the bevels and the extrusion as completely different surfaces. That way we can, once we're in layout, we can surface those and have different properties. So you can make the face blue and the bevels gold or something. This will help them stand out more. If you want, you can make them all the same color and all your parameters the same, but it's nice to have that flexibility. So you want to build that in from the very beginning. So since we have the faces selected, we'll hit Q to go to the Change Surface dialog, and we'll call these faces, like that. Hit OK. Now, we want to hide those polygons because we're not going to use them right now, so we hit minus, and that hides them. Now we want to select just the bevels, so again we use the nice little lasso. And we have just the bevels, so we hit Q again, and we'll change this one to bevels, like that, and hit minus to hide them. Now these are going to be just the edges. We don't need to select them because they're the only things left in the scene, or in your project. So we hit Q, and we change this one to edges, like that. And then you hit the backslash to bring everything back. Now one last thing that I do on the type here, everything looks fine, but the bevel command, for some reason, it leaves little stray one-point polygons laying around. I'm not sure why, it just does. So I always hit M for merge. It brings up the merge points dialog. We just leave the range automatic. What this is going to do is find all the points that are sitting on top of other points and combine them all together. Hit OK, it found 20 points. Our model still looks exactly the same. We didn't actually do anything, we just got rid of those extra points. You don't always have to do that. You could probably get away with not doing it, but I just like to clean up after myself, and I don't like little stray one-point polygons sitting around that I didn't create on purpose. So here we have our nice little motion graphics type. It's kind of boring though. It's not really doing much. So what if we take it and we make an arc out of it? So we make it into a circle. We have like a couple different copies, and we'll have it spin around. That should be kind of cool. In order to do that, we're going to have to bend the face. Now, bending polygons is always tricky because if you bend it too much, you break it. It's like glass. So what we need to do is we need to give this logo places to bend. The way you do that is through the Julian command, and that is under the Construct tab. When you hit Julian, or Julienne, I don't know, whatever it is, it's however you make fries. we get this nice little prompt. We want to be working in the x-axis. It's going to make slices along here on the x, and we'll give it, oh, say 50. It's going to create a bunch of slices. We're going to zoom in again using the period key. We'll zoom in here, and you notice it made a bunch of slices in the background, but it didn't actually slice the faces. For some strange reason, every now and then, some fonts, the Julienne command doesn't work. What it should do is make these slices and then actually slice them. It didn't do that. So we're going to show you how to fix that. First off, we have to just sort of change the background slicers a little bit. So we'll hit the apostrophe key. This switches our foreground and background layers, and we'll zoom out just a little bit. We use the H key from the right hand view, and this will let us scale it up just a little bit to make it a little bit bigger so it fits in there better. And then we'll go back, we'll hit apostrophe again to switch our foreground and background again, and we'll hit Shift R. This brings up our template drill. But this time, instead of cutting a tunnel, we're going to cut a slice. And there we go. Now we have these nice little seams right here. That's going to give the type some place to bend around. So we're done with our slicers in the background. Hit apostrophe to switch layers, hit X to get rid of them, and apostrophe again. Again, I'm just cleaning up after myself. So now we're going to build an arc for these things to go around. So what we'll do is we'll move into layer 2. We'll use that as a template in the background. We're going to use the spline guide tool, which is a lot more accurate than the bend tool. And another thing that it lets us do is it lets us save our guide that we're bending against, and that way we can bend other things on that same arc if we wanted to. But first we need to build that arc. The easiest way to do that is to make a circle from the top view. So we're going to select the disk tool, position ourselves right in the center, and hit Control as we drag. That way we get a nice round circle, and we'll make it, oh, about that big. Zoom out, and we're going to select just a few of these points on the front here. We're trying to select the M in motion is going to start at the side, and then the S in graphics is going to end on the other side. So if we wanted the arc to last about this long, we would select these points here. If that's bending around too much, you could always just select these points, which is about what I'm going to do. So once you have those points selected, we're going to make an open curve. Then we're going to select just the disk, and then hit X to cut it. All we're left here is this nice little curve. So we throw that back into the background, and motion graphics comes up to the front again. Go over to the Modify tab. Under the Stretch segment, find Spline Guide. This calls up this requester here. We'll make it a little bigger. So we want to activate it, and we want to change operation to bend, and we want to get our background curve. And now we're bending along that curve, nice and quickly and easily. So we hit Enter to do it. Close that. And now we'll go over to the Modify tab and select Center 1D, which is under Center 2D. That's going to let us center it vertically, like so. And here we have a nice curved motion graphics. And you can see that the faces are clean, and they're going to render clean because we cut the divisions into them. Now we need a few more to fill up our arc. We want to have a whole circle of these things. So what we want to do is we want to do an array that's a radial array because we're going around the center point. Under the Multiply tab, go down to Array and select Radial. Now we're going to have to sort of figure we want, say like 5 or 6 of them. Let's try 5. We're going to go around the y-axis, and the center is going to be 0, 0, 0. And here's our nice arc of motion graphics. Like that. So we can have this thing spinning around and doing something interesting. Okay. Now, inside the middle of that circle, we want something else. We need a base. So what we're going to do is we're going to bring in another piece of Illustrator art. We go to a new layer, and we go to the Illustrator import again, and this time we're going to change our file to Lightwave. Make sure we're on fine, closed polygon. Do that. Zoom in on this guy. And here we have the words Lightwave. And we have to cut out the hole in the A. So we'll select that, cut it, go to an empty layer, paste it, make that our background layer, and do the Shift R to get the template drill. We're on the Z axis still, but we want tunnel. Hit OK. And it didn't work. Again, we have one of those fonts that doesn't like to work. So we'll select that, zoom in on it, select the point here, hit Control L to split the polygon, and now when we do our template drill, now it cuts it. So we'll select those polygons and hit Shift Z to merge them into one. And there we go. That's what it's supposed to look like. Now we can clean up after ourselves. Go to this layer, get rid of the A, and go there. Now on this one, we're going to extrude again. So Shift E, hold down Control, drag it out. There we go. There's our extrusion. Now we want to bevel. So I'm going to zoom in so I have a little bit more control. Select our front polygons and our back polygons. Hit B for bevel. And I'm going to bevel in a little bit like that. But on this one I'm going to be a little bit more fancy. I'm not content with just that bevel. I want more. So if I hit the right mouse button, I will commit that bevel and I can start a new one. So I'm going to bevel in a little ways. And I'm going to hit the right mouse button. And now I can bevel in and actually inset it. So now we have like an outline bevel there. And I'm going to accept that. And this one I'm going to surface as the face. So I hit Q, change this as to Lightwave face. Hit minus to hide them. Now I want to select the bevels. Like that. Hit Q. I'm going to name those Lightwave bevels and hide them. And now all I'm left with the edges, so I call those Lightwave edges. There we go. Bring back everything. And now I just need to clean up after myself, so I do my merge points. And only found 12 that time. So there we go. There's our Lightwave type. That is going to sit inside the center of our motion graphics rings. One of the things I like to do when I have a big block of type like this is cut it up into individual letters. Then I can fly and animate them separately, and you're not left with this big monolithic thing. It allows you to do a little bit more because the letters can tumble or flip or something, and yet they still live as one big unit. So first what I'm going to do is center this whole thing, because we're going to be rotating around the centers of the letters, so you need them to be at the origin. Hit F2, that should center everything. And now, zoom out a little bit, and I'm going to select all these guys, everything but the first letter. Then if you hit the right square bracket, it selects all of the polygons that are connected to the ones that I manually selected. That ensures that you get the entire letters. We cut that and we move to the next layer and we paste it. And then you select everything but the I and hit the open bracket, cut it, move to the next layer, paste it. Everything but the G, cut it, move, paste. Everything but the H, and so on, and so on. And now, here's where we have a little bit of a problem. When we select the E and we cut it, we've run out of layers up here. That's why I like to have my layer window always open on the side. This is a much better way to show all your layers. I can have an unlimited number. I'm not limited to the original 10 that I had up here. And I can still do the same things. I can set things in the foreground or the background. I can even, if I have multiple objects open, have one object be a foreground and another object be the background. This layer panel is great. You should get used to using it. And if I were you, I would never use these ever. You can take a Post-it and put it up on the screen and cover those up so that you forget that they're there. So now we've got the E, and I need to paste it into my last layer. Now let me just make sure that I didn't miss anything. I have the L, I, G, H, T, W, A, V, and the E. You want to make sure that you're double checking yourself as you go, because you could accidentally have cut out 2 letters and forgot to paste one of them, and you get through the whole thing and you spelled Lightwave. And, you know, that's not right. You want to catch those mistakes from the very beginning. So double check yourself. Now that we have all the letters in individual layers, we need to make them so that they're ready to animate. Right now, if I were to take this into layout and try to animate there, if I were to rotate this E along its heading, it would fly through space because it's actually rotating around the center of the modeler space, the origin. We want to tell the modeler that it's going to be rotating around some other point. We do that by setting the pivot, which is under the detail panel. We go to pivot. Now, the easiest way that I've found to do this is from our back view. You hit A and it fills the screen with that letter. And you just move to approximately the middle. And now you move to the next layer, hit A, stick it about in the middle. Next layer, A, stick it in the middle. And so on until you finish all your letters. This is the kind of repetitive stuff that is kind of tedious, but will make it easier later when you actually go to animate. And your animations will look better. And there we go. Now let's save this object. File, save object as, and we're going to call this Lightwave Motion Graphics, like so. So now we've basically set up some type that can rotate around, and the word Lightwave as individual layers, which we can animate, and we can fly these letters in completely separately if we want. And now we're ready to take it into layout. Alright, so that's it for our modeling. The main points to remember are that you want extrusions and bevels. That'll help your type look more three-dimensional. If you're going to be bending type, you want to make sure that you slice it so that you have some place for it to bend. Use your layer panel and chop everything up into as many individual parts as possible, because even though you may not animate with them as separate parts, you want to do that now so you have the option. I can treat them all as one unit later when I get into layout, but if I get in there and I start animating and I decide that I want to animate them separately and I have to go back into Modeler, I'm not going to be happy. So I'll just do it now. I'll get used to it. It's a habit. I'll be much happier later. So now we're going to move into layout. So here we've got layout all set up with a nice empty scene. So the first thing we need to do is load in that object that we just saved. We go to Add, Load Object, and Lightwave Motion Graphics. There we go. Brings it in all nice and neat for us. First thing that we want to do is set up a good rest position for the camera. We want to find a place where you can read your logo, where it looks dramatic, where you make sure that it's going to fit right on everybody's television screens, where you know you have a good starting point. From there we can build around, but we need to know that you can actually read it first. So what we do is we switch to the camera view. I use the number keys to do that, but you can also change them up here. The camera view is 6. Now we want to switch so that the camera is the object that we're editing, and you can see that I can't really tell what that says. It's not a very fun position, so we're going to move the camera. Move it over here. One of the things I like doing is having the camera below my type so I'm looking up at it. It makes it look more exciting and interesting. So we'll move it over, then we move it down, and we're going to have to rotate the camera so we're looking up at it. It's kind of small though. So what we might want to do is open up the camera properties and we can zoom in on it. Move this over to the side so I can see what I'm doing. And we'll zoom in a bit. Make it nice and big. Like that. Okay. Now that looks nice and big and it fills the screen rather nicely. Unfortunately, it's probably too big. On most people's television sets, you don't know how much of the image you're actually going to be seeing. So there's a thing called safe title that you have to call up in order to make sure that you're within some bounds where you're guaranteed to be seen on the television. You do that through the display properties. Hit D for display, and all the way down at the bottom is show safe areas. We'll click that on and close that, and you see it made 2 rounded rectangles. The outside one is safe action. You're generally okay to have most of the action occurring within that. Anything outside of that is probably not ever going to be seen. The inside rectangle is safe title. You don't ever really want to have any of your titles going out that because you might lose it, and you might have people at home sitting there watching and they can only read the top halves of your letters or something. They're not going to be happy. So you can see that the L and the E are sticking out beyond safe title. We don't want to do that. So I'm going to have to zoom back out a ways. That's pretty good. Just because you have safe title there doesn't mean that I have to take my logo and actually fill all of safe title with it. That might be too big. In this case, it definitely is. It's just a guide. You don't really want to go outside that too much if you're expecting somebody to be able to read it. So we're actually going to set up something like this and maybe rotate it down a little bit more so that we're centered on that. This is our base position. This is where we're going to land. We can have all kinds of other things happening. We may be moving the camera all over the place, but at some point we want to pass through this position and kind of linger here, because we know that we can read our logo here. That's the most important thing. Whatever else you're doing, whatever kinds of cool particle effects you've got going, whatever else, neat reflections, you need to be able to read your logo. That's the most important thing. Always remember that. You have to read your logo. Otherwise, it's a joke. What you're doing is pointless. So keep that in mind every step of the way. You're trying to read your logo. All right. So let's start by making something interesting happen. We started with the motion graphics. We made an arc out of it. Right now, we can't really see it. You can see the back of it, but you can't really see it. We want to make something interesting happen with it. So how about if we did something where we take that arc and we have it kind of explode from out of the center. So it just gets bigger as we go, and maybe it fades off at the end. And then we have another one does it at a different angle. And we have these things just kind of blowing out, constantly blowing up and out and stuff. Now, how would we do that? Well, the first thing you want to do is we'll set up the motion of it getting bigger. So we'll select that object. Go to Object, and we'll change the current item here to Layer 1. Which is our motion graphics object. Now, first thing we want to do, on frame 0, we're going to size it down to absolutely nothing. Like that. Then after about 60 frames, 2 seconds, we'll have it be at its maximum point. We'll have it blow up, and it'll get maybe about that big. So let's just take a look at that real quick. It's going to do that. Okay, that's not the most interesting thing in the world. We want to add a little bit of a rotation to it. So go to the Rotate tool, and we want to isolate just the heading. So we click off the P and the B buttons, and we'll rotate it that much. Take a look at it again. There we go. That's a little bit more interesting. Now you see I'm only playing the first 2 seconds of our animation. Let's say we're doing a 12-second animation. That's 360 frames. And now if I look at it, it blows up, it's rotating, and then it just stops. We want this to be a repeating cycle. So the first thing we want to do is open the graph editor, and that gives us control over our motion in a much easier way than just little tick marks down on the timeline. So we're going to take the rotation and make sure that it just continually rotates. So we go to the rotation H, change our pre-behavior to offset repeat, and our post-behavior to offset repeat. And you see our motion graph now continues on even past our keyframes. It just goes, it goes, it goes. It's just going to keep rotating around forever. Now, we want to take our scale, and we're going to take those, and we want them to repeat. So it's going to start small, get big, and then it's going to get small again in one frame, and just keep doing that over and over again. But we want to add a little bit of a delay in between the times when it starts and finishes. So we'll add a couple more keyframes here. The last keyframe was on 60, so we'll add another one, frame 61, and its scale is going to be 0. And we'll add another one, say, at 75. And that guy's at 0 too. And notice that our repeat now takes a little bit longer before it goes. We also want to set all of these keyframes to linear. So select them, go to incoming curve, and change it to linear. Okay, let's check out, see what we did. Close the graph editor and play it. It rotates around, and then it disappears, and it'll come out again. Okay, now the next thing that we want to do is we want to take that, and at the very end, just as it's getting big, we want to dissolve it out. That's under Item Properties, so we'll hit P for Properties, and under the Render tab, we'll go to Object Dissolve. So we want to make an envelope for that. That'll open up the graph editor. And we want to make a keyframe at 60. And it'll be 100% dissolved out. And then we have to add the 2 extra keyframes for the delay, one at 61 and one at 75. Like so. And we'll set all of these guys to linear. Now, what this is going to do, it's going to start out completely non-dissolved. In other words, completely there. It's also going to be very, very small. As it gets bigger over the 2 seconds, it's also getting more and more transparent. We don't necessarily want that. We want it to be solid, and only in the last 15 frames, the last half second, we want it to get transparent. So we need another keyframe in here at frame 45. We'll set its value to 0, and we'll make sure that it's linear. And now you can see what it does. From frame 0 to 45, it's not dissolved at all. And then from 45 to 60, it quickly dissolves out. From 60 to 61, it goes back to being not dissolved at all. That's when it's shrunk down and it's waiting to expand again. And now we need to set our pre and our post behaviors to repeat. And it'll keep doing the same pattern over and over again. So let's close the motion graph editor, and we'll close the object properties. And we're not actually going to be able to see this as we play it, because the OpenGL doesn't really dissolve. We'll be able to see it when it renders, we just can't see it now. We'll do some F9 tests later on to make sure that it worked. Now, having one of those guys is kind of boring. Also, I don't like the way that it just comes out horizontal and just kind of expands and stuff. What I would like it to do is maybe be tilted off to an angle and maybe have more than one come out, so it's a never-ending cycle of these things continuously spewing out. So How are we going to do that? Well, first what we want to do is rotate it so that it's on a different angle. However, since it's already rotating on its heading, if we were to now change the pitch, you might find that it gives it a little bit of a wobble. We don't want to do that. What we want to do is have the heading rotation that it's on completely isolated from its sort of more general orientation. In order to do that, we're going to parent it to a null, rotate the null, and then it still rotates in its own local coordinate system. So we'll go ahead and we'll add ourselves a null, and we'll just call it null because I'm not very creative. And then we'll go up to the scene editor where we can parent it. So we'll just drag it down underneath the null, and you want to make sure that you're getting the little indentation. That means it's being parented like that. Now if we take our null, close the scene editor, and if we rotate the null around, you can see we can do some nice rotations here, and we'll set that keyframe at 0. Now when we play it, it's going around that sort of offset rotation that we've got. Now we need to make a whole bunch of these things. How many do we need? Well, it takes 75 frames before it starts up again. So depending on how often we're going to have each one start, we're going to need quite a bit of them. We'll have them be 5 frames apart. So under the scene editor, we'll go to this first null, and there's an L script that comes with Lightwave that doesn't always get added to your command structure in here. I've moved it to the add menu. It's called clone hierarchy. What it will do is it will take whatever item you have currently selected and any of its children and any of their children's children and so on, and make an exact duplicate of that structure. So let's go ahead and do that now. Clone hierarchy. If you don't have that command under the add menu, what you can do is you can add it yourself. This is a handy one. You want to have somewhere where you can access it quickly. Under the layout tab, under interface, go to edit menu layout, and you'll get a little window where we can configure our menus. It's a plugin, so under the command plugins, you can unfold that, scroll down until you find clone hierarchy right there, and then we want to add it to our menus on the left hand side. That's our main menu. Under items, the blank one, add, and I already have it added, but if you select clone and clone hierarchy over here and click on add, it'll put a clone hierarchy button underneath your clone button, which is a nice place to have it. So then you just click done, and you now have a new button down there. So we've added a second null. This is not quite enough to repeat this thing out as many times as we want. So we're going to add a bunch more. So that's starting at frame 0. That'll be at 5. That'll be at 10. That'll be 15. 20. 25. 30. 35. 40, 45, 50, we need a lot of these, 55, 60, 65, and this last one starts at 70. Then it'll start its whole sequence again, and the first one will start at 75. Now, while we're here, we'll close all these guys up, because we're only going to select the nulls right now. It just makes it easier to make sure that we know what we're doing. I'm going to move the scene editor kind of out of the way but where we can still see what we're selecting. We'll also go in a little ways. Frame 17. Select the first guy, rotate him like this. And this is going very slowly because our OpenGL card is not very fast on this computer. So there's no crime in setting everything to bounding box, like so. It's going to update a lot quicker. So we want to just set these guys at sort of random rotations, so that each version of the motion graphics ring comes off on its own sort of unique pathway. And it looks like a mess right now because they're all at the same position in their expansion. But in just a moment, I'm going to show you how to grab them and move them in time so that they come out sequentially instead. And as you can tell, I'm not trying to be terribly accurate with any of this. I'm just kind of moving these wherever. Makes it look a little bit more random. Okay, so now select all our nulls. We'll create a keyframe at frame 0. Get rid of the one we have on frame 17. And we'll take a look and see what happens. Now they're all exploding out in completely different directions, all at the same time. We don't want that. We want them to go sequentially. So we take our first guy, and we're going to have to expand all these open again, because the nulls aren't actually doing any animating. It's the object underneath. We're going to have to slide those guys in time. Now open up the scene editor as big as we can make it, because we have quite a few items here. Alright, now I could grab these, and I can just grab the timeline and just slide them around manually. But it's not always easy to be terribly accurate with that. And we want these to come out precisely 5 frames apart. So we want to select all of the layers except for the very first one. And we're going to shift them all in time by exactly 5 frames. So we go up to the top right corner under Shift keys. Shift key times for selected items. Low frame is 0. We can make the high frame, some huge number. That way you don't accidentally make it too small. And we'll shift frames by 5. Now everything's moved over 5 frames. Now we deselect number 2. We go back to Shift key times for selected items. Hit 5 again. And we keep deselecting the top one and doing the Shift keys by 5 each time until we reach the bottom. And here we go. That's our last one. So we'll close the scene editor, and we're back on the main interface. Now, what happens when we play them now? You can see, hopefully, that they're coming out and expanding, and there's always some motion. There's always one of them that's getting bigger. And that's what we want. Now, what does it look like when we're not in bounding box mode? Looks like that. So we have a nice cloud. And how about I render a preview so we can see this in sort of real time. Rendering previews as you work is a good way to make sure that your motion is going to look like what you want. Just pushing the play button down there on the bottom right hand corner underneath the timeline gives you a good sense of it, but you really need to run a preview because your OpenGL card is going to dictate how fast you can just play the timeline. When you render a preview, it's actually rendering out a little AVI or a little QuickTime movie, and that you can play back, and you get a much better sense for how it's really going to render, how the pacing actually works. Now that looks pretty good. You got to remember that as the letters are getting bigger, they're going to be dissolving out. So even though right now it looks like they're just popping out and disappearing, when we actually do the final render, it'll look much smoother. The only thing I might say is that the rotation might be a little too fast for my taste. So let's slow down the rotation on all those guys. We'll end the preview, and we'll go into the scene editor, and we'll select all the rotating guys. Like so. And then we open up the graph editor again. And if you hit Shift G, it loads everything that you have selected in layout into the graph editor. Now, we don't want to be dealing with all of these channels. We want to filter it down so that we only are looking at the heading rotation. Under Channels, go to Filter, and we change our pattern to star.rotation.h. You have to make sure that you capitalize the words rotation and the letter H. The star is a wild card, so anything that starts with anything and ends with rotation.h is going to be selected. Hit OK, and we have quite a bit fewer things to worry about. We select all those, and we're going to grab all the keyframes on the top, and if we move them down like that, then it's not rotating as much, and that should wind up being a lot better. So we'll close this, and we'll close the scene editor. Alright, so we're going to render another preview and see how that worked out. We want it to go a little bit faster on the render time, so we're going to change to wireframe mode, like so. And this should allow us to construct our preview a little bit more quickly. Preview, make preview, hit OK, and it's going to crank away. So hopefully what we're going to find is that our rotation is now not quite so frenetic. They're still going to be expanding as quickly as they were before, but they're not going to be spinning in our face quite so badly. Alright, so here's our next preview. Move the controls out of the way, and we'll play it. Yeah, that looks a little bit better. It's not quite so frenetic. I like that. That'll work good. Now we need to work on the Lightwave type, because it's just kind of sitting there like a lump. We need to make it more interesting. In order to do that, we want to make it so that we don't have to worry about the motion graphics type, because that's just going to kind of annoy us and get in the way. So we'll go into the scene editor. We should still have all of those pieces selected, but if not, you can easily select them all. Under the Visibility tab, change them to Hide Selected Items, and they'll disappear from our main view as soon as we select something else. And there we go. All we're left with is the Lightwave type. So what we want to do is we want to select all those layers, like so. So we're going to have the move last about a second. So we want to make a keyframe right at a second at their rest positions. Since they're already there now, we just hit Enter and make a keyframe at 30, and enter again, and now there's a frame there. Now we're at frame 0. This is where we want them to start. So we'll select the Move tool, and we can move them all as a unit because they're all individually selected all together. And we'll get them closer and closer to the camera and move them so that they're just out of view. There we go. Alright, now when they fly in, okay, that's not too exciting. So we need a little bit else, something else. So about 15, we'll make it so that they fly up. This will give it a swoop down. And at frame 0, we'll go to the Rotate tool, and I'm going to switch to perspective mode by hitting 4. And then I'm going to center on the objects and zoom out just a little bit. So now, with my Rotate tool, I can have them spin around, and maybe we'll spin it on bank too. Go back to the camera, and they tumble in. I'm not sure we want them to land and just smack down quite that hard. we want it to ease into it. So it slows into it. And in fact, it might be kind of nice if it slows into it, but it doesn't completely stop, but it actually goes on a little bit and then comes back. So what we want to do is go to its rest frame, and this is where it's settled, but it's actually going to come back to this point. So at frame 60, we're going to make another keyframe here. Frame 60, like that. And let's see what that looks like. So they fly in and they go a little bit beyond it and they come back. Like that. Okay, that's pretty good, but it's still, when it ends, it's still a little bit abrupt. So we can smooth that out using tension. We'll go into the graph editor, and we'll select all of our selected items by hitting Shift G. That gets everybody in there. You can see we've got all these channels now. We want to select all the channels. And let's just zoom in here. We'll select all the keyframes, hit Shift A, and that expands it so we're only looking at the keyframes. Now we want to select the keyframes right here at frame 60, give them a tension of 1. That'll smooth it out. At the very beginning, at frame 0, give it a tension of -1. That makes it come in with as much velocity as we can get. At frame 30, we don't want it to do this overextension quite so much. So we're going to bring the bias back a little to maybe about like -0.75. And we'll take a look and see how that looks. Close that. And do a little play. There we go. That feels better. Okay, that's good. But they're all coming in at the same time. We want them to come in L-I-G-H-T and so on, one right after the other. So in this case, I'm going to select the first one, leave it at frame 0. The next one, move it over 1 frame. After that, this is 2 frames, this one's 3 frames, and so on. So there you go. Each letter is starting 1 frame after the letter before it. So what does that look like? That's better. But let's stretch it out just a little bit more. We'll make them 2 frames apart. Okay. Let's see what that one looks like. There we go. Now they tumble in and come to rest. Now somewhere they're just going to be sitting there once they hit, and they'll be kind of boring. So we want to have something else going on. When you're working with CG logos, a lot of times if something is just sitting still, it doesn't look very interesting. It's not doing anything. It's not alive. It just really dies. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to take all those letters and we're going to parent them to a null. So we'll add ourselves a null right now, like so. Go into the scene editor so that we can parent everything. We'll fold up all the motion graphics guys so that we have a little bit more room. Like that. Then we select all our letters and parent them to our brand new null, like so. Select our parent, and now we'll close that. And now we'll give it a little bit of a rotation along its heading. So it'll wind up like this. So they fly in, it's still rotating. Yeah, I like that. Okay. Now at the very end, somehow we need to make this thing disappear. To do that, what we're going to do is we're going to have it expand and then quickly contract and turn into nothing. And we want that to happen pretty quickly. So since our entire animation is 360 frames, we'll have it take place in about a second. So we'll make a keyframe here just on scale at frame 330, and then we'll go to frame 360 and we'll change the size Change that scale to 0. Now it goes away to nothing. But we want it to expand a little bit first and then quickly shrink down. So by frame 347, it's going to want to be 0.531 scale. We want it to be much larger than that, like so. Let's see what that looks like. Okay, that's fairly good, but we're getting a little bit of a drift on the scale. So we need to set our tension in the graph editor for scale. On the keyframe that's at 330, you need to set that to 1. We'll set the very last one to -1, so it jumps into there really quick. And then we'll do something else. On rotation, we're going to add a keyframe here at 330. Like so. And then we're going to grab this very last keyframe at 360, and we're going to make it really high. And you'll see what it does to our curve. It kind of whacks it out, so we need to go back to bias. We'll make the bias like a +1, and that straightens it out again. Let's see what that does. There we go. In fact, it could even be more intense than that. We're rotating to -374 degrees. Let's rotate to -360 times 5. That'll make it spin around 5 times, which is -1800 degrees. And we'll look at the end of it again. It's rotating, and whoa, that's too much. Divide that in half, so that's -900. Take a look at that. Yeah, I kind of like that. Now in the middle here, if you notice, as we're sitting here watching this, you go, okay, well, it flies in, kind of interesting, and then it kind of sits there and doesn't really do too much. And then it'll finally, eventually, zip out. What if in the middle, just as we're starting to get really bored of it, right about there, about 7 seconds in, what if we take all the letters and have them do a little tumble? You don't want your viewer to get bored. So we're going to the scene editor, and we're going to take these temporarily and slide them all back to frame 0 so that we can give them all a tumble all at the same time. We can animate all these items at once, and then when I reshift all their times, their tumbles will start separately. Okay, so we're back to normal, and we're on frame 210. Oops, I need to select them all. Like so. Now we're going to make a keyframe just for our rotation and only for the pitch channel. And then we'll make another keyframe, but instead of being on 210, we'll make it 225. We'll do a ½ tumble. So at that 225, we need to go into the graph editor, and we'll get out all of our selected items. We need to filter it so we're only looking at pitch. So that's the rotation.p. Hit OK. So all we're left with is pitch. We'll select all of them. And we want just this very last keyframe here at 225. We want them all to flip 360 degrees, like so. And the keyframe at 210, we're going to have to set the tension to 1 so that we don't have any motion on the pitch before we get to it. We want it to be a surprise. Alright. Now another thing that I like to do sometimes is I'll have one letter tumble one direction and the letter next to it tumbles the other way. And we keep alternating back and forth. In order to do that, I need to select every other item over here, I'll grab its last keyframe and I'll make these negative 360 degrees. So half of them are rotating one direction and half rotate the other. So let's take a look at that real quick. We'll go here, and they rotate like that. Now right now they're all doing it in unison, and we know we don't want that, so we go to the scene editor and we move these guys over. They're 2 frames each, and this is going to offset not only the beginning fly-ins but also their little tumble. Close that, and let's look at the whole thing. They fly in, kind of rotate around, do their tumble, and then it flies out. Okay, so now let's take a look and see what it looks like if we turn on the motion graphics type as well. Go back to the scene editor. We will select all objects, change the visibility on all objects to texture shaded solid. Now we'll close the scene editor, go back, and we get to do another preview. When you're making previews in Lightwave, it's important to remember what's actually happening here. Lightwave is actually taking screen grabs of your display. So if you were to say call up your email or call up Solitaire, start playing a game like that, you would actually be capturing that when you're making the preview. So you have to leave your screen completely unfettered of other windows. And this will allow Lightwave to capture what it's supposed to capture. Okay, so here's our preview. Let's play it out and take a look. I think that's going to look pretty good. And one of the nice things about these tumble actions, you can kind of see it just in the preview, is the way that the letters catch the light. It kind of forces them to do a glint pass across them without resorting to trying to position a spotlight and getting it just so that the specular hits it just right and everything. You just tumble the letters and it kind of glints. It kind of gives it a reason to glint as well. One of the things that I like to do when I'm moving things around is I like to pretend like it's a real object. And why is it moving this way? I don't like to just float the camera and oh, it's going over here. And you gotta sort of pretend like there's a reason for all these things. It's not, it's just a flying logo. But if things have weight and they feel like they have inertia, I think that it tends to make them look a little bit better. So I think this is a pretty good start here. I think we're basically at the point now where we need to start lighting and surfacing and make sure that everything looks good in that respect. We may come back a little bit later on once we've lit and surfaced everything and tweak some animation a little bit in case something doesn't quite look right once it's all surfaced and lit. But this is a good base. It gives us something to start with, and we can develop it much further later on if we need to. Okay, so now we're doing surfacing and lighting. I do these together because your surface is so dependent on how your lights are set up. I like to use shadow map spotlights almost exclusively. They render quickly, you still get a shadow, and you have lots of controls that you don't have in some of your other light types. So what we're going to do first is just focus on the word Lightwave, because that's our main primary read. All these motion graphics flying around, I look at that as our secondary read. So we're going to hide them for now and just look at the words Lightwave and figure out how to light and surface that one to make it really stand out and look good. So we're going to the scene editor and we're going to select all of our items which we don't want to see, and we'll hide them. Like so. So all we're left with is the word Lightwave. Now, the best way to do this is to have lights that aren't shining at it like straight on. You want to kind of rake a light across it. You want some fall off. You want a bright part and a darker part. Gradients are good. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our light, we'll look through the light, and we're going to call up its properties panel, make it a spotlight, change the shadows to shadow maps, and I like to increase the spotlight soft edge angle so that it's roughly about half of what the cone angle is. This will give us some nice fall off around the edges. Now this light, we want to parent to the same null that's rotating the word Lightwave around. That way the light is held in the same position respective to the word Lightwave. So we'll go into the scene editor, we'll grab the light and parent it to the same null here, like so. And now you'll see when we're looking through the light, we're rotating along with it. And that way we can set up a good angle for this and it's not going to change. So we'll make sure that we're at a point where all the words have already flown in, like this. And we're going to move this light so it's kind of up here in the corner a little bit. And rotate it so we see the whole thing, like that. Now we're going to switch to the camera angle, and we have to make a keyframe at 0 for this light. And we'll take a look and see what it looks like. So as it goes, you see it's staying lit the whole time. Let's see how the light actually is affecting our type. So I'm going to hit F9 and do a really quick render here and just sort of see where I'm at. Okay, well, all the motion graphics type is kind of getting in the way, and you can see it's casting shadows on the Lightwave type, which we don't like. But you can also see that we're getting a brighter part at the very beginning, and it sort of tails off, and that's good. We like that. I like the way that the light is striking the edges of the bevels like that to really set them off. It's not shiny or anything yet, we know that. But I think that's generally a good place for that light. Before we do more tests, let's get rid of all these motion graphics. Let's make it so that we can't see those at all. So we have to do that through the scene editor. And open all these guys up. And a really quick and easy way is to just click the little check marks next to all of them. And this makes it so that they don't render. Alright, and let's try another F9. There we go. That's a little bit better. Okay, now I don't have anti-aliasing turned on right now, so everything looks a little jagged. This was just a test for basic lighting. That's a good start. Now we're also going to need a light. We want a light that's going to catch along the bottoms of these letters here to just really kind of set them off. So we're going to add a light. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to clone the light that I have currently. That way it's got all its parenting information and everything all set up. Go to the light view. In this one we're going to move it, and we're going to move it over onto this side and then down, rotate it up and around, so we're looking at the undersides of those letters. Like so, and we're going to go in a little bit tighter on it too by changing the spotlight cone angle. Like so, and then we can open this guy up a little bit. And we're also going to start changing the colors of our lights. I don't like using pure white lights. They tend to look rather stale and boring. I like adding just a hint of color. On our main light here, we're going to make this just a little bit yellow. Just a little tiny bit. It's almost white, but it's just got a flavor of yellow. It's just going to tint things a bit. Then our light down here, we're going to get kind of a deep, deep blue. Almost a purpley blue. We're going to try that. And another thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to go into the global illumination panel. I'm going to turn off ambient intensity. Just turn it off entirely. There are uses for it, but generally I like turning it off, and then if I need it, I can raise it up. And when I do raise it up, I usually don't do it by very much. So now we'll make a keyframe for this light and look at the camera and see how it looks now. do an F9. And it's much darker now because I got rid of the ambient intensity. Okay, the light underneath is not quite bright enough. I made it too dark of a color. So let's go back into properties and bring it up, something like that. Now we'll do another F9. Okay, well, we're getting a little bit there, but you know what? Part of the problem we're experiencing now is that we're doing this onto gray letters. We need to go into our surfacing editor and really spice this up a little bit. So we're working with the Lightwave faces, edges, and bevels. First thing I always do when I'm doing type is I select all of them and I turn on smoothing at a smooth threshold of about 30. The default level of 89.5 is way too high. You get things trying to smooth itself over that really shouldn't. 30 is a good compromise. This will allow any smooth edges to look smooth, but it'll still let us keep some hard boundaries. Now another thing we want to do is we want to give everything specularity. Everything is shiny. We like shiny type. We'll increase the glossiness to about 60. That'll tighten the pinpoints of light. And we're going to give everything some color. The face, we want to have a nice bright color. So we'll make a nice bright gold, kind of an orangey, yellowy gold, like that. And in fact, we're going to make the bevels the same color. So I can select that surface with the right mouse. I can copy that surface and then paste it into the bevels. The edges, on the other hand, we're going to make them be a darker color. This will give you some contrast. One of the important things to do when you're designing a logo is to remember that it's all about contrast. You need a light logo on a dark background or dark logo on a light background. You want to be able to read your logo even in a black and white TV. And to do that, you need to have a brightness, darkness contrast going on. The edges help work with the background to set off the face of the type. So we're going to make that a fairly dark color. Again, I'm going to take this something similar to what our backlight is, but even darker, like a dark blue, like so. And let's see what that looks like. Okay, well, that's very dark. So what we're going to need to do is add a couple more lights maybe. We'll select our primary light. We're going to clone that guy. And this one is going to be up a little higher and looking at it from this side. Like that. Make a keyframe. Let's take a look. Okay, well now we have really bright faces, really bright bevels, dark edges, you can hardly see them. And you know, I think what I want to do is I want to set the bevels off from the face. So I'm actually going to make the face a little bit darker. A little bit more orange, a little bit darker. Maybe there. I'm even going to take down the diffuse a bit. There we go, that's looking better. Now, it's getting a little hard to tell what's going on with these bevels because they're so chunky. So I'm going to turn on anti-aliasing in the camera panel. Select the camera, go to Properties. Turn on anti-aliasing. Low should be good enough. We just need to smooth it out a bit. Now F9. There we go, that's looking better. It's still a little boring though. It needs like those glints and the highlights and the really interesting parts. So we could do that by trying to add lights and position them so that we get the highlights just right and all that kind of stuff. But you know, I've found that a really easy way to do this is by using high dynamic range images as our backdrop. So let's go to the image editor real quickly. And we're going to load an HDR. So we're on Images, go to HDR. So I like Building Probe, and I'll show you why. This image was taken inside some office building or something, and I like the windows that it's got up here. It provides some nice glints, plus it's like really dark down there, but there's some interesting detail, little highlights of things all over the place. Now, this is called a light probe image because the photographer actually had a silvered ball that he took a picture of, which gives him this wraparound view of the entire environment. Don't confuse light probes with HDR. HDR is a completely different technology where you take multiple exposures of the same scene and then you combine them in the computer, so the computer knows that this pixel, say, is very dark and this pixel is very white. Many times they've been doing these light probes and HDRs kind of together to get a really good idea of the entire environment around you, what the lighting situation is, but they're not necessarily the same thing. In this case, this is both an HDR and a light probe. In order to apply this in Lightwave, there's a special plugin. So we close all these, go into the Scene tab, and we go into the Backdrop panel where we add an environmental plugin called Image World. Double click it and we choose the Building Probe HDR. This is a special plugin that unwraps that silvered ball so it fills the entire environment around us. These backdrops can be picked up by any reflective surfaces that we have in layout. Right now we don't have any, so we need to make these guys reflective. We'll go into the surface editor, select our three guys because we want them all to be reflective. And instead of just cranking reflection up to 100%, I'm going to add a gradient, and I'll show you why. Go into the texture editor and select gradient, change the input parameter to incidence angle. This means that this gradient is going to be based on how we're looking at things. Are we looking at it straight on, or are we looking at it kind of with a glancing view? By adding another parameter here at 90 degrees and setting it to 0, we're saying that when we look at something straight on, we don't want it to be reflective at all. When we look at it at a glancing angle and it's at 100%, we want it to be totally reflective. That's going to allow us to just pick up these highlights and glints around the edges of our objects. So we'll use that texture, and you can even see in our surface sphere here that around the edges it's much more intense than in the center. I can exaggerate this if I were to add another keyframe into the gradient to affect kind of the gamma of it. So you can see you can really isolate where you want the highlights to occur. But we'll get rid of that for now. We'll use this texture and we'll take a look. We'll see what we've got. Alright, well, we're picking up some highlights in there. You can see the tops of the letters are picking up that skylight that we saw. To really get a good idea, though, we're going to have to look at it from a few different angles. Look at it over here. Like so. You can see there's glints under there, there's things going on. And it's looking pretty good so far. What about when it's doing its tumble? What is it doing? We should be catching lots of different colors and highlights when we do this. As you can see, the H and the T, they're almost getting blown out. And the edge here. So we're hitting lots of good things. But you know, it's still going to be static. And a lot of times when you're looking at a logo on TV, one of the things that they've done is you see the reflections moving across the face. Again, it keeps it breathing, it keeps it alive. You want things moving. You don't want everything moving, but you want as much moving as you can get. So we want a glint to run over everything. Unfortunately, you can't actually rotate that image. But what we can do is we can rotate the entire universe underneath that image. So we're going to add a null, and we're going to the scene editor, and we're going to parent everything to that null. So we'll close this up to make it a little bit easier to get at everything. We'll select all our objects, parent to the null, and then we have to parent the camera to the null as well. Now we take that null, and over the course of the entire animation, we're going to rotate it 360 degrees on our heading, on our pitch, and our bank. Now you'll see when we run the animation, you can see by the grid that the entire world is rotating around us. But it still looks like the animation that we had before. Now that image is locked to the grid, to the world coordinates. We're rotating under it, so it's going to look as if the image is rotating around us. And so before, where we had highlights, we may not be getting highlights in the same spot. In fact, you can see we're looking at a different part of that backdrop. Now, it's kind of annoying to see it back here behind us. I don't really like using those images as actual backplates for an animation. So what we're going to do, when we render this, we don't want that to be back there. So we go to the image editor again. We're going to load up just a blank black image, completely black. Under the Scene tab, we go to Compositing, and we select that black image and put it as the background image. What this does is the backdrop images are being seen by the reflections. This compositing background image is not seen by the reflections, it's only seen by the camera. So you're kind of tricking it into putting a black background back there. So now we don't have to look at those windows and all that stuff. It's floating in its own black universe again. Now, why is that so important? Because when we go to a frame where there's going to be some really bright highlights, okay. So when we go to a frame where there's some really bright highlights, like the undersides of these letters here, there's nothing really to tell us that it's that bright. We want this to react as if it was in real life. If you were pointing a camera at something and the sun is reflecting off of it, you would not expect it to just be white. You would expect the camera to react to that bright light. You're going to get glows and little highlights. That's what we want. That's going to help sell all these glints and stuff. So in order to do that, we're going to add a plugin called Corona. Again, under the Scene tab, it's in the Image Processing panel, and it's an image filter. Now, when you open up the interface for Corona, the most important thing in here is the input threshold. This tells Corona how bright a pixel has to be on the screen before it applies its effect. 95 is usually fairly good. That means it's got to be pretty bright. Also, fall off is a good one. You can either be smooth or center biased or solid box or ring. I tend to like center bias. It'll take this glow right there and put that over any pixel that is over 95% bright. Right now the strength is at 50% and size is 25. Those are good places to start. So let's see how it looks just with these settings. Okay, that's a little bit too bright. This would be called overkill. This is what happens when you go too crazy with Corona. As you can see, it's not only getting the highlights, but it's basically taking anything that's bright. We don't really want that. We want to take down the effect. So what I'm going to do first is go into our Image World plugin and take the brightness down to about 35 should be pretty good. And let's take a look at that and see what effect that has. Okay, well that's better. It's still maybe a little bright. I'm not sure I really want it to be affecting these areas where mainly it's just a light bulb hitting it. So we're going to have to actually change Corona as well. Let's go back into that panel. We'll make this up a little bit brighter, 97. And I'll take the strength down to 25 as well. That way the effect isn't quite so pronounced. So now, by setting it to 97, the pixels have to be that much brighter in order to be affected. And then even once they are there, it's not going to be as strong of an effect. So let's see how that looks. Okay, yeah, that's much better. You can see that it's there, but it's very faint. It's not overly done. You don't want to blob out all your details. Let's try a different frame. Let's go to one of these where it's like tumbling. See how that looks. Okay. It looks pretty good. It's maybe a little light now. Let's bring it back up to 40. So it's a little bit brighter. Let's see what it looks like over here. All right, yeah, you're catching it mainly on the V and the G over here. Just as they rotate up and they reflect off some window or some highlight that's up in this direction, it's going to just bloom out just a little bit. And I think that's what you want. You don't want to overdo it. You don't want these to be like lens flares that everyone uses all over the place. It's just a little subtle touch. Okay. Now another thing that I like to do is I like to have my logos have motion blur. But unfortunately, the motion blur that you turn on through the camera panel right here frequently takes longer than I have to render. My deadlines are too short to do that. So what I like to do is use another image processing plugin called Vector Blur. And in fact, I'm going to turn off Corona, put it on the bottom right now so that we don't see the effects of that. We'll just do Vector Blur. Vector Blur comes in two modes, Vector and Blur. Blur mode is when you're setting up camera motion blur in the camera panel. This helps kind of smooth out the steppiness that you get. Vector Blur is when you don't have motion blur turned on at all. And what it does is it figures out where each pixel is moving per frame, and it does a motion blur just per individual pixel. So you have some parts of the screen getting motion blurred one direction, some parts getting motion blurred in another direction. It actually works quite well. And I'm going to turn on high quality blur. It just makes it just a little bit better. So let's see how it looks. If we're on a frame where not too much is moving, I'm not going to really expect motion blur or vector blur to do much at all. In fact, you can see, you probably can't even tell that it's turned on. However, at a frame like this where they're all tumbling around each other, I would expect it to be doing quite a bit. There you go. We're getting some motion blur in around the letters here, like that. Now what happens if we go to one where they're actually flying in? It's taking a lot longer to render it this time because the objects are closer to the camera and they're moving more over one individual frame, so the blur length is going to be much longer. You want to be kind of careful when you're using vector blur, and you don't want to move the camera actually into an object, because what happens is as you get closer, and as that object gets right up next to the camera, you almost have an infinite blur going on, and it just takes too long to render that blur. Okay, so that's finished. Let's take a look. You can see there's a lot of blurring going on. Now the letters are dark because there's no light on it at this point. It's only getting reflected light from the image world background around us, but you can definitely see that there's some streaks going on. Let me render one really quickly with vector blur turned off, and you can see the difference. First off, you'll notice it's going to render a lot quicker. In fact, we're done already. This is without vector blur. This is with it on. So you can see that we're definitely getting a blurring effect there. Now, this also highlights a problem here. We have no light shining on these things. We're going to have to add another light to highlight them until they enter the cone of light in the rest position. This is why it's important to do test renders throughout your entire animation. So we'll take this light and we'll clone it, and we'll look through the light at 5. We're going to move it over here and point it down. We want it to be at a spot where it's going to see them all the way. Now here it's leaving the cone, and as we'll see by looking in, there's still a period where they're in shadow. So we need to sort of aim it like this, make a keyframe for us. But we don't really want this light to be affecting it in its rest position, which it's just missing it. Because I think the lighting looked good before. If this light was over too far, it would be lighting it up even when they're settled. And we don't necessarily want that. So this is a good place for it. You can see that now it's not in shadow the whole way. Let's take a look, see how it looks. Okay, that's without vector blur. When you're using vector blur and corona together in the same animation, you want to have vector blur occur first, and corona occurs second. Because if you apply corona, you get the fuzzy glows and stuff, and then you smear it all out with vector blur. What you really want is more like real life, where the object is moving and is blurring, and then you're getting the blooms happening over that. So here's our finished render, and you can see now it's got motion blur turned on. And it's a little hard to tell in a still, but this is going to add a lot more life to your animation. Without and with. It just helps sell the motion a little bit better. Now let's turn corona on and get the effect of both of these plugins. Alright, so here we go. This is with vector blur and corona turned on. This is just vector blur. That's with corona. You can see it's blowing this area out just a little bit, and we're getting a little bit of a extra little bloom going on down there. It's not a lot. You want to stay subtle with this effect, but it is showing up. Now we need to deal with the motion graphics type. We haven't dealt with that at all. So let's take the Lightwave part, and we're going to select all these and hide them, and we're going to show everybody else. Okay, now we can also need to turn on all their check marks. Otherwise we would do an F9 and they wouldn't render, and we would be very confused. There we go. Now that's what it's supposed to look like. So If we did an F9 now, we're going to see the same thing. Remember, the Lightwave is under here, we just don't see it. But we're going to see all these motion graphics casting shadows onto that type. We really don't want that. So the first thing we're going to have to do is turn off the shadows for all of those objects. We could do that by going into the Properties panel for each of those objects individually and turning off all our shadow options. Or we could do it through the spreadsheet, which makes applying changes like that to many different objects all at the same time much easier. So here's our spreadsheet. We're going to have it display only the objects, and then we want to look at the object properties, render flags. See, here we have self shadow, cast shadows, receive shadows. I want all those turned off for the motion graphics layers, which are all these guys. You can select all of them at once. You hold down the Shift key and it selects both the columns and the rows. And we just change it to unchecked and then apply that effect. Close the spreadsheet, and you'll see when we go into properties for any of these motion graphics and we go to render, they're turned off. All turned off. But if you look up at the Lightwave type, these are still turned on because they want to cast a shadow across themselves, the individual letters. So now let's do a test render and see what we're working with. Alright, and here's our render. You can see that we're getting some motion blur on the type here, and our corona is working. It maybe is a little intense in this frame, but let's try to bring out the motion graphics type. It needs to be brighter. It needs to be a little bit less like a big solid ring. So what we're going to do is close that down, open up Surface Editor. We're going to select all those guys. Again, we'll apply a smoothing of 30 to just those surfaces. And we're not going to have it be affected by the lights at all. So we're going to turn down the diffuse. But we're going to turn up specularity. So it'll still get some highlights off of that stuff. And we're going to make the color kind of a bright gold. Like that. And we're going to change the luminosity. And again, we're going to use a gradient based on incidence angle and basically do the same effect where we have 0 when we're facing it and we have 100% when it's turned to the side. When you use that texture, and you can see what it does. It's like right around the edges it's nice and highlighted. In the middle it's very dark. And I kind of like that. So now we'll do a test render here and see what it looks like. Okay, you can read the type a little bit better now, but it still looks like a solid object. What we want to do instead of just this is we want to turn on, under the Advanced panel, Additive Transparency. And what that'll do is that'll take the value of an individual pixel, and instead of just overwriting whatever is behind it, it'll actually add that value to what's behind it. So you get things get brighter as they build up. It's not exactly the same as transparency, but it has a similar effect. Also, I want to make the bevels even brighter. So I'm going to take this, instead of being at 100%, I want them at 150%. And let's see how that looks. So you notice that doing that is slowing it down, slowing down this render a lot. That's because Lightwave is rendering this by rendering a bit and then drawing what's on top and then rendering a bit and drawing what's on top, and it has a Z-buffer ordering method of rendering this that in some cases is very fast, but when you have multiple transparent things overlaying each other, it's actually quite slow. And you can see here that we have, up in here we have 3 different arcs of type all laying over each other. And here we have even more. That's what's slowing it down. So how do we get around that? Well, we tell Lightwave that we don't want it to render using that method. We want it to actually ray trace the transparency. So that doesn't, we're not getting reflections out of it, we're not getting like weird refractions or anything like that. We're just telling it to, instead of building what's back here and then drawing on top of it, we're building what's in front and it ray traces what's behind it. For some reason it does it faster that way. At least it better do it faster. So you see it renders a lot faster when you turn that on. We're also going to need to use that switch later on if we're going to add a volumetric light behind everything. Because if we don't have ray trace transparency turned on, you wouldn't see the volumetric light through all of our motion graphics type. But we want to. Another thing that we want to do is pick up all of the same highlights that we're getting in the rest of the type. So we're going to have to add reflection to that. We'll do that through our gradient again. Like so. And now you see we're going to be picking up a little bit more bright spots. Let's try this out. So right now we're adding in all the little details, all the little glints and highlights, and our motion looks pretty good, our basic lighting setup looks pretty good, but we're just trying to get the little finer points, the little things that you're going to catch as it moves, the stuff that adds production value to it. It makes it look a little bit more richer. Okay, so here's the render that we've got, and you can see that we're getting a little bit of extra glints and highlights, and the corona is making it look good. We're seeing the vector blur, and you can tell there's motion, but this is a good time to sort of take a step back and do the squint test, where you stand back at the other side of the room and you squint at it and you see if you can still read it. And with all this gold on the Lightwave type, it's a little tough to read. And also, I'm not sure that this motion graphics, that all of this cloud wants to be quite this big. It's kind of making the Lightwave type not quite as dominant. So why don't we do just a couple little tweaks just at the end here, and I think we're almost done with this part of it. So first off, what we're going to do is we're going to take the gold out of the letters. We're going to make them more like the edges. So we'll go into the surface editor, and here's our Lightwave edges, here's our Lightwave face. So we're going to make them both kind of this dark purpley color, like so. I think that'll look nice, juxtaposed against these bright gold bevels here. And then what we're going to do is we want to take this cloud of motion graphics, and I think I want to shrink it down a little bit. So let's go into here, and we're going to add a null object, like so, and we're going to select all the parents of all of the motion graphics guys, parent them to number 18, and then we have to remember that we're rotating the entire universe, so we have to parent that guy back to our master control parent. There we go. Lots of parenting. Now if we take our new parent number 18 and we shrink it down, it shrinks everything associated with it. And now we get sort of more of a, we can see that they're orbiting. We get more of a feel that Lightwave has these motion graphics going around it, that it's controlling everything. So we'll make a keyframe at 0 there, and we'll take a look, see how it's going to work. They fly in. Yeah, I think I'm going to like this a little bit better. So let's do one quick last render check, see if we're ready to put it on the farm yet. And there we go. Oh yeah, that's nice. We get nice clean type here with sort of a highlighted glow around it. And you can see that the Lightwave type just shows up a lot cleaner. If you do the squint test on it, it's much more legible. That's much better. Also, by shrinking down this whole cloud of motion graphics, you feel the arcs better. You can see that they're going around it, and it feels much more like Lightwave is the center of this little motion graphics atom or something. So I think we're basically ready to set it up to render now. So we'll go into the camera properties, check everything out there. Depending on what kind of editing system you're going to be working with, you might have to change these settings a little bit. But most of the time you're going to be rendering D1 NTSC. Unless, of course, you're in England or something, you're going to be rendering in PAL. But for us Yanks, it's 720 by 486, and the pixel aspect ratio is 0.9. You shouldn't have to set that. It does it for you. Your anti-aliasing, you're going to want to experiment with. You want it high enough that your edges are nice and smooth, but you want it low enough that it doesn't take forever to render. So we'll set it at medium. We'll leave adaptive sampling turned on, which means it only will resample and re-render just the very, very harshest areas, edges. And that's about it. I tend to never turn on field rendering. I don't like stuff when it's rendered with fields turned on. It makes it look a little too slick, a little too clean. For some reason it looks cheaper to me. When I render it just on frames, it doesn't exactly feel like it's film, but it kind of has that effect. That's not to say you can't render with field rendering. I just personally don't like it. If you are going to render with fields turned on, you're going to have to do an experiment with your editing system to find out whether you're even first or odd first. So now we're going to go into the render options panel where we set our file. You want to make sure that your render last frame is set up high enough, 360, and we're going to check our output files. I like to render to PNG files. I used to actually render to JPEGs, but yes, they're lossy. That's the problem. They're smaller than Targas or anything, but they're lossy. PNGs are nice because you can do a 32-bit PNG, which includes the alpha channel, so we can key this over other footage or something later. I'll show you how to do that in After Effects. So we just set up our output modules, and we're going to render this to Lightwave motion graphics. Like that. And if you're going to be rendering over any kind of render farm, you have to save it as individual RGB files. If you're rendering it just on your local machine, you might be tempted to save out directly as an AVI, but that's really not a good idea. If you're rendering and you're rendering 360 frames, and on frame 359 you take a power hit and your machine goes down, you've just lost all 359 of those frames that you just rendered. If you render as individual RGB files, every frame it renders, it saves that off. And so you've got those backed up. So after your power hit at 359, you only have to render one more frame. So you can always compile it into an animation later, and in fact it's better to do that in a program like After Effects or Digital Fusion or something. I always render as individual RGB files. And I think we're set. So we'll do one last save of the scene. We'll save this one as number 5. And then before you do anything else, make sure you do a save all objects. And wait until that's done. And then we're going to take this into After Effects, and we're going to do a little post-processing on that, and I'm going to show you how you'd set it up to key over other footage, or maybe we can even make a background in After Effects. Alright, so now that we've got it rendered, we're going to want to see what it looks like, and I almost always do some kind of post-processing to it to take the CG edge off of it and to just kind of crank the colors a little bit more and just get a little bit more intensity that Lightwave isn't able to give you. And to do that, I'm going to be using After Effects. There's a lot of good compositors out there that you can use. I like After Effects, so some of the steps that I do here may be specific to After Effects, but you can do generally the same kind of thing in any compositor. So first we're going to import the footage. So here we are in After Effects, and the first thing we're going to do is import that footage that we just rendered. Now the file I'm going to be importing is not exactly the same as what you and I just built. This is something I rendered out last night. But it's close enough so that we'll know what we're doing. To import a selection in After Effects, you just click on the first file, make sure you select that it's a sequence, and go ahead and open it. If it has an alpha channel, it's going to ask you what to do with it. I typically leave it as straight unmatted. So now when you bring it in, we want to make a new composition out of it, we drag it down onto the new composition button, and it automatically makes a composition. It's the right size, the right pixel aspect ratio, the right length, all that good stuff. If we hit 0, it'll make a little RAM preview and we can see what it looks like. So here we go. This is how it plays back. Looks pretty good. I like the way the motion graphics type is coming off of there like that. But let's see if there's anything we can do to make it just a little bit better. So one of the things that I like to do a lot of times is to take this layer and then duplicate it twice. So you have 2 copies of it. Now we'll switch to layer modes. We'll take the top layer and we'll switch it to add, and the middle layer, we'll switch that one to multiply. And now let's make our image a little larger so we can really see what we're doing. And we'll get rid of these guys because we don't need them. Okay. Now, it's a little bright and it's still a little hard edged. So I'm going to take the top one that's the add mode and I'm going to apply a blur to it. We'll just give it a little bit of a Gaussian blur at about 10. It fuzzes it up just a little bit. That's maybe too much. Let's try 5. That's a little better. It's still a little intense. So we'll go into it, and if you hit T, that brings up the opacity control, and we'll change that to 50. There. Now it's still being applied, and it's a little bit more intense than it was originally. We'll take a snapshot of that, like so, and then I'm going to turn off those 2 layers so we can see the difference. See, it's just a little bit brighter. It may be hard to see on this monitor here, but when we play this back full screen, you can see the glows a little bit better. We'll turn those 2 layers back on. We're going to increase the opacity of the top one to about 65, so it's a little bit brighter, and we're going to blur it out just even more. We'll put it at 7.5. Now it's got a little bit of a glow to it. Let's see what happens when we render out a RAM preview. What we're trying to do is give the whole thing just a little bit of a fuzzy glow. And the reason that we're doing this in After Effects and then we're not trying to tweak Corona is because you can see how much faster this is. If I were tweaking Corona, I'd have to sit there and do F9s over and over again, but there's no point in doing that. I've got a base that looks really good. So I'm just tweaking little things, you know, a little bit of opacity, a little blur here and there, and it's not exactly instantaneous, but it's much faster than doing it in Lightwave. That's one of the great things about using a program like After Effects to do your post-processing. You get it as close as you possibly can in Lightwave, and then just take it the next step in After Effects. Also, what would happen if we had this and someone wanted to change the color? Well, let's see what it looks like first, just playing out. So I think that looks pretty good. But what if they didn't like that purple? What if they wanted it to be red? Well, if we had to go back into Lightwave to change the color, you know, we'd have to sit there and go back and re-render the whole thing. Instead, what we could do is we could add an adjustment layer. And make sure that it starts at time 0. And we'll apply an effect to that. We'll apply the Adjust Hue Saturation effect. An adjustment layer will apply this effect to all the layers which are underneath it. So in this case, we're going to be changing the hue. And you can see I can change the hue all the way around so that the edges are red. Of course, now the bevels are green, so that's not quite the effect we want. Get rid of that effect, and we'll go to the Change Color effect, which is under Image Control. Here we can actually select the color that we're looking for. We want to change that purple. And then we can check and look at our mask and see what we're actually going to be changing. We can increase the tolerance so it knows what is purple enough to change. We can adjust the softness so it will change it based on a sliding off gradation scale. And then we can decide what we want to do with it. So we go back and we look at the corrected layer, and now we want to rotate the hue around. So we don't want it to be blue, we don't want it to be purple, we want it to be red. You know, that was pretty quick to change that. If you had to do that in Lightwave and re-render, it wouldn't be hard to do. You just go into Surface Editor and make it red. It's the re-rendering time that you don't want to have to go through. That's why After Effects and other post-processing tools are really, really good for this kind of things. Okay, so let's put this over a background now. We'll import some footage, and what I'm going to be loading are a couple movies, little low-res versions of some backgrounds that I got from a company called 12-Inch Design. These are very nice backgrounds that we actually use on Access Hollywood, and they're just nice and handy for when you don't have the time to render an entire environment or a background. So we've loaded these up. Let's put one of them behind everything. We'll drop it down into the timeline, and you can see we have an instant background. Now, since this is a low-res version of it, it's not coming in the full screen, so we're going to need to scale it up. Let's just do that really quick. These are designed for high def in mind, but you can use them in regular D1 NTSC if you like. So now we'll just do a test of this and see how it looks. As we're watching this render, we can see something that I personally don't like. The motion graphics, as it's fading out, it's turning black. And I don't really like that effect. So we're going to have to figure out some way around that. So what are we going to do? Well, let's start off by getting rid of our add and our multiply versions. We're going to start with the basics. We have our one layer on a background. And you can see how it goes black in here, just as it starts fading out. An easy way to get rid of that is to set this to add mode, because these letters are in add mode, and they're going to add on top of that. Like so. Now the black is gone. Everything looks like it's kind of burned into that background. And our type changed color a little bit, because you can see when it's on normal, it's sort of a darker blue or purple. When it's in add mode, it's more of a reddish purple. And that's because it's actually mixing with this background. It's not necessarily a bad thing that it's doing that. And in fact, I quite like it. It marries the two, and it brings them together into more of a cohesive unit. It feels more like it's inside this environment. So we'll do a little test right here. We'll do a RAM preview, see how it looks. Personally, I'm not too happy that we've got that purple in there. It's getting a little Pepto-Bismol for me. So what we're going to do is we're going to change the color of just that purple to something that's a little bit more to my taste. So we'll turn off this layer just for a moment, and we'll go and we'll grab the effect for changing colors. Under the image control, change color. Move this out of the way so we can see what we're doing. And we're going to grab the purple right there, and we can see what we're changing. So we'll look at our mask, bring the softness up a bit, just enough so that we don't catch things that we want. Bring tolerance up a little bit more. Softness could go down. Alright, so these are the colors that we're changing. And we'll go back to corrected layer. Now we want to rotate it around. Let's see what this looks like once we add mode. It's a little too orange. There we go. We're getting a blue again. We can even make it darker if we wanted to, but then it just disappears. So we'll leave it right where it's at. We'll do another RAM preview. This time we'll do it at regular size so we can really see what we're doing. Now I think this is looking pretty good. I think it could look a little bit better though. I'm going to do a variation on the 2-layer add multiply thing. We're only going to use 1 layer this time. You can see when I stack 2 add modes on top of each other, it gets much more intense. But if we take one of these layers that's on add mode, and let's say we blur it out just a little bit. So we'll grab a Gaussian blur, and we'll increase that up a little ways to like 12. And we get this kind of nice, soft, kind of glowing look. But it might be adding up a little too much in here. So if we take this add mode and we add a track matte, and we say we're going to use the alpha inverted matte, it's grabbing the alpha channel of the layer above it, and it only shows it in the inverse of that alpha channel. So where the layer above it exists, the layer below will not, and vice versa. That way we get the glow only around the outsides of the letters, and we're not getting a piled up inside the letter. If we turn off the track matte, you can see that the glow exists underneath there. So when you turn on the top layer, it's adding up and it's getting a little too bright. If we turn the alpha inverted matte back on, you can see that it's cutting a hole in it, so it's not going to layer up and get too bright on us. And I think that looks really good. So now let's do another RAM preview for the whole thing and just sort of see how the whole motion looks. Okay, so here's a RAM preview. I think it looks pretty good. I think if you took this to some company named Lightwave Motion Graphics, you could make some money. So again, what I'm trying to do here is I'm just trying to soften it up, make it so that it's not quite so obvious that it just got spit out of a 3D program. There's lots of different variations that you can do on this, and I hope you'll experiment and find them, and I hope you've learned something. Thanks a lot.